What are your questions? I'm listening. Full radar out. No questions. Are you too tired this morning? Or is it again the phenomenon of intimidation? Now, look, of course, I would like to have normal, natural questions, not somebody whom you pay nearly to ask each time 2 questions. Are there no? If there are no questions, of course, then we can. Yes.
Through the second chapter of the Davidovich book, she was just talking about how anti-Semitism came to be such a big deal in Germany. Is all that history really that important to you for us to know, or you just want us to know that just the time period? What is the significance, I guess, of that?
The significance of the development of anti-Semitism in Germany.
Right.
Well, look, the development of anti-Semitism in Germany, to put it, openly and clearly, that essentially happened in the 19th century. There were, of course, but that was not limited to Germany. By the way, there was also the development of anti-Semitism in France in the late 19th century. You see, anti-Semitism developed as a reaction of the establishment to the liberation of the Jewish population in Europe, in Germany in particular, and in France, when after the French Revolution the Jews were given the same status, the same rights and all the others. And of course, this provoked then on the part of the establishment which had denied the same rights to the Jewish people. They considered it as a kind of provocation. You see that human behavior in many ways is the same. Look, for instance, what happened in the United States after 1865. Then came a backlash from the white population against the liberation of the African Americans. And this kind of denial, this kind of reaction lasted for a long time, even to some degree until the present. And the same was true when the Jewish people were given equal rights. This provoked an anti-Semitism and racialism, which is, of course, or anti-Semitism is like a twin brother of racialism. Because it all, you see, men usually have the need to look down on others, to have at least one field where they feel superior. And so those who have no strong national capacities and talents, they look around to see what they could use to look down on somebody else. And of course, racialism and anti-Semitism is a very cheap and a very easy thing to try to make a difference, to see, well, I am at least better than so-and-so. It is unfortunate, but that is a part of human nature. And to come back to your question, it's 19th century. It's from after the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars, and particularly in the middle of the 19th century and in the late 19th century. That is a time period when this modern anti-Semitism, I'll come back to it as soon as we are through with Hitler. Yes?
But wasn't anti-Semitism also spreading all over Europe, not specifically in Germany or Russia?
All over Europe, yes. But it was particularly virulent in Germany and in Russia, because it was, let's say, it was not even that virulent in Germany. It was particularly strong in Russia, because in Russia it was used as a means to divert the resistance and the dissatisfaction of the vast masses from the incapacity of the government to make reforms. It was a diversion. It was diversionary tactics on the part of the Tsarist government. The same as they used also a kind of adventurous, aggressive foreign policy to divert from their incapacity to solve the domestic problems. Are there other questions? If not, then yes.
In Munich, we went on a tour, and they were talking about when they made the last march, and 16 Nazis got shot, and Hitler supposedly took the boy to the hospital. And then they also talked about how at the Munich push, Hitler left and left someone else in charge.
Okay, you anticipate of what I intended and
Okay.
intended. Now, to put it clear, you are referring to the failed Hitler putsch. On this failed Hitler putsch, I do not want to avoid giving you an answer, but I'll come back to it when we talk about it today. Maybe today, certainly next time. It was simply during this clash between the Nazis who tried to organize a march upon Berlin, starting from Munich, and the police, which had erected a barricade, let's say a place where they wanted to stop the Nazis. There were shots exchanged, and 19 people, let me see, yeah, I think 19 people died, 16 Nazis and 3 policemen. And Hitler immediately went to the ground. He was slightly wounded. He went into hiding, and 2 days later he was arrested. It was not a very glorious moment in his life, but he got over it. Okay, we'll come to this when we get to the failed putsch. Other questions? Okay. Now, just tell me, where did we stop last time?
Bavarian triple threat again.
Yeah, I remember, because you caught me off guard when I did not check my watch and when I was already, let's say, imposing a greater stress on your patience. Now, we were talking about the problems of the Weimar Republic. Let me just review a little bit what I saw last time so that you can have a look on your notes. The first problem was the birth of the Weimar Republic. It was a defeat, and this defeat, with all its consequences, and the peace treaty had to be shouldered. And that was already a burden in itself and a problem. It was accompanied back home with a breakdown of the existing regime, the empire, and the proclamation of 2 different regimes. And immediately following a civil war situation where the moderate socialists used the army to crush the communists who tried to seize power in Berlin first and then afterwards in Munich. It then, I did not speak about another attempt which was made after this communist violent, let's say, revolt, which did not even become a revolution. The pendulum was then from the left swinging back to the right. Conservative generals and politicians then tried another coup against Berlin, but where they tried to restore a conservative, or to establish a conservative type of dictatorship. Now, this is referred to as the Kapp putsch. Kapp, K-A-P-P. A putsch is a violent attempt to seize power. It failed. That was in 1920. In 1920, I thought last time I would just go over it, but as you will see it in your book, so you should know, 1919 was the communist attempt which was crushed. It was also the development of the Constitution. We spoke about the flaws of the Constitution. 1920 was a Kapp putsch, the conservative attempt to seize power, which failed also. 1921 was then the reparation issue, where they had to pay, where they had to sign an agreement that they would pay over years and years 132 billion gold marks, what the Germans considered as the enslavement of generations. And then 1922, a year afterwards, when they signed an agreement, the Weimar Republic, and particularly the Minister of Foreign Affairs, by the name of Walter Rathenau. You find this also in Bullock in your book, and also in Davidovich. Rathenau, he was a Jewish great industrialist. He was the owner, his family was the owner of the big German trust AEG. It doesn't exist today any longer, but it was comparable to General Electric. It was a very big company. And he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he signed then with the Russians an agreement, the Rapallo Treaty. Remember, I mentioned that to you last time, in which the two countries agreed not to raise reparation demands against one another, and where the Germans, the Weimar Republic, recognized the Soviet Union as a true, as a regime, and where they also decided to cooperate economically and secretly also militarily. By the way, if you look up in Davidovich, you will see that Walter Rathenau, the man who signed this agreement, and also the man who had signed the reparation treaty the year before, he was assassinated by German nationalists. This is the same time of political assassinations and a violent outburst of anti-Semitism accompanied even the days before he was assassinated. He was in a libel, he was called Schlag sie tot die Judensau, this Jewish sow. In other words, it was not exactly, let's say, a decent language, but he was assassinated as a consequence. By the way, the man who signed the armistice, that was a Catholic politician, Erzberger, he was also assassinated by the German nationalists. Anyway, that was 1922. And then the French, we get then to the year 1923, that's where we stop. The French did take that, the French were furious over this agreement between the Soviet Union and the Weimar Republic. So they did take advantage of a pretext of a delay in the delivery of telephone poles to have their army enter the Ruhr. And with the consequences we saw, strike, passive resistance, and astronomical catastrophic inflation, which practically wiped out the German currency. So that was the economic, the monetary problem, plus French separatism in the Rhineland, the danger, the risk to see the left part of the German territory on the Rhine to split away and maybe even later on join France. Then I spoke about another danger that was in Saxony-Thuringia, the communist danger, where the communists were in a coalition with the socialists, and the communists were already developing a red militia, that is armed communist military units, with the danger of a communist takeover. And then we turned to Bavaria, where there was a triple danger looming. The monarchists, the Bavarian monarchists, they wanted to split away to join Austria in restoring a Central European monarchy. But of course, for Germany it was a problem. Bavaria would split away from, in other words, the German territory would even become smaller. But this danger was not now that imminent. The second danger came from the Bavarian nationalists, or the conservatives. And I mentioned three names to you last time. There was the Bavarian head of state, that was Kahr. He had a particle, he was von Kahr. There was the head of the Bavarian army, the general von Lossow, and the head of the Bavarian police, von Seisser. So in other words, these three top officials, head of state, head of army, head of police, they were known to be opposed to the Berlin government, because in Berlin the government was more, we would say, center-left. The socialists played an important role, because after all, the president of the Republic was Friedrich Ebert, a socialist. So the Bavarian conservatives, they certainly were opposed to the Berlin government. And there were rumors that they might try to make a political coup against Berlin. In addition now, there was now Hitler. Also, in November 1923, Hitler's National Socialists, they also wanted to bring Berlin down. And Hitler had, as an example, as a model for his political coup, he had Mussolini. Now, Mussolini, I'm not going to speak at any length about Mussolini's background. Remember only this: Mussolini had seized power in Italy in October 1922 through a march of his black shirts. This was the paramilitary unit. These were the paramilitary units which Mussolini had mobilized, a march of his black shirts against Rome. When he organized this march on Rome, the king, in order to avoid a clash between the fascists, because that was the name his party and his black shirts had, the fascists and the official army, because the king could have used the army to stop them, but he wanted to avoid bloodshed, so instead of stopping Mussolini, he simply nominated, under the pressure of this march, Mussolini prime minister. So in other words, Mussolini came to power thanks to this march upon Rome. And Hitler, of course, he looked at Mussolini as a great model, as an example to be followed. So that was in Hitler's intentions, in Hitler's plans. Now, as we have seen the general stage in November 1923, let's have a look now how Hitler came to this position. Because what we have seen so far about Hitler's evolution was that he had attended in 1919, in September 1919, he had attended a meeting of a small splinter group which called itself DAP, German Workers' Party, and he had done this at the request of his army superiors, because he was supposed to report to the army intelligence of what kind of a group this was, the DAP, so that the army knew how to act, how to behave towards this kind of small group. And they were not the only ones, there were many of those groups all over Munich. Now Hitler liked the kind of people he met. And so he, instead of listening quietly of what they were saying, he could not control himself, so he asked for making a speech during this meeting. And this speech apparently did please those who had organized the meeting, so that they asked him whether he would be willing to join them, to become a member of this DAP. And he said yes, on the condition that the army would let him do it. So he went back to his army superiors and asked whether he could join this group. And that is how he got involved in this DAP. Now, I will open, I do not have any kind of instrument to write on this whiteboard, so I will open it and it will be blackboard. So just excuse me for a moment, and I will put a number of names there, because even though I could say, well, look, after all, when you do the reading in Davidovich and also in Fest and in Bullock, you will come across all those names and you will immediately recognize them. But I know, after all, having been a student myself and knowing your predecessors, that you preferred to see those names printed or written out with my impossible European handwriting, which I will then spell for you, if necessary. The name of this group, which called itself a party, was DAP, which means in German Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, German Workers' Party. That is the name of this little group which had organized this meeting and which Hitler attended. And the leader, the chairman of this group, was a craftsman, a locksmith, by the name of Anton, that's his first name, Drexler. Drexler was the official leader of this small group. But of course, it was not a very important group. We do not even know how many members they had. Had they tens of members or hundreds of members, they might have been. It was never for sure recognized how many they were. They might have been 100 or 200 or 300, not more. But those, even those who were members, the members did not always all attend those meetings. But once Hitler now became a member, because he had made such an impressive speech, they put him in charge of propaganda and of recruiting new members. And that was, of course, something which he liked, because propaganda, to attract people. So in other words, he was put in charge of this. Now, later on, he claimed, because all his statements and even his later writings, Mein Kampf, he transformed the reality so that it would suit his imagination or his desire to be looked upon. So later on he claimed that he had the member card of the party number 7, because 7 was a kind of magical number, but he did not have the number 7 because there were many more members before he came. Apparently his real number was 545, something like that. But he later on claimed, because that looked good, if you have number 7, it's better than number 545. So that's for little detail. Now, I would like to say a word about the man, Hitler, because we are in 1919. Hitler was at that time already 30 years old, because after all he was born in 1989. And he had all those experiences in Vienna and the front experience, being the runner soldier. But how did he differentiate himself from the other members of this small group? He was different from all the others, not only because of his capacities, because of his ideas, but because of his personal status. All the other members had a family and had a profession, had a job. So in other words, and that is normal, because if you are a member of a party, you are not only now a member of a party. You have a social status, you are a bachelor, you have a family, and you have a job. Now, most of the others had families and jobs. So in other words, they could only dedicate a limited time period for their political activity in the party. That was not the case for Hitler. Hitler had no family, he was a bachelor, and he had no job. In other words, he lived at that time. He was paid, at least as an army intelligence agent. He did not have to work to make a living. So he had all the free time, which he will then dedicate to his new job, if you want, as being in charge of recruiting and making publicity propaganda. So in other words, he was at a clear advantage compared to all the other party members. So what did he do? He immediately changed the meeting habits. He would not now organize meetings in a small room, in a backstair room of a cafe, where you would have at best 20 or 30 people. He, on the contrary, he would rent a huge hall where you could have hundreds of people who would attend the meeting. And he would open the meetings not to the party members, but he would make publicity so that he would also attract non-party members, all those who had free time, who had an interest. So public meetings where everybody was invited. And some of those meetings did take place in an area which Hitler liked very much. That was one of the reasons, if you ever go to Munich, the Hofbräuhaus, this huge beer hall. And that was a place which Hitler will use for his public meetings. Now, during those public meetings, where everybody was invited, who would make necessarily a speech? Hitler. He would be speaker in all those meetings. Now, that does not mean that one of the other party members could not make a speech, but he was usually the main speaker. and he impressed his audiences. And so at the end of those meetings, those who attended, quite a few came then and joined the party. So that his recruiting campaign and his public meetings had as an effect that the number of party members did increase rapidly. That in a few months, the number of party members had been multiplied by 10. And of course, whom did the new party members know best? Of course, Hitler. Because the other members of the committee of the party, they were not always there, they did not always speak, so that ultimately it looked as if Hitler were the true head of the party. So in other words, with the evolution of his recruiting campaign and his meetings, he ensured himself of a solid following which looked at him as a true party leader. This had as a consequence, after, let's say, a couple of months, that except for Drexler, the original leader, Drexler remained member of the party, but most other committee members, out of jealousy, out of disappointment, or they could not stand Hitler, they resigned. So that ultimately Hitler had a free hand to run this new party. And he will use this. He will use this from 1920 on. He carried through a number of changes, you would call it reforms, to give the party a new program, a new outlook, and also a number of paramilitary units which he had organized by by one of his lieutenants. In other words, he impressed now on this new party his style, his ideas. Now, what were these innovations now? First of all, he changed the name of the party. The original name was DAP, German Workers' Party. Hitler now called it NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, that's a long name, and ultimately people got accustomed, they would not call, when they spoke about this new group, they would not call it currently, popularly, NSDAP. They would simply take an abbreviation of the two first words, national and socialist. And if you make an abbreviation, nationalsozialistisch, that gives you Nazi. Nazi is an abbreviation of National Socialist, the German abbreviation, of course. Nationalsozialistische. NA, the first two letters, and from sozialistisch you take the Z and the I from socialist. Now, originally, the word Nazi did not have a negative connotation. It got this negative connotation only later, when all the crimes and all these terrible things they had on their program, and they did, became known. So originally Nazi in Bavaria was even a kind of sympathetic denomination, originally. Not later on when Hitler was in power, of course. Now, you could say, well, why did he do this? What was the idea behind this National Socialism? Here we are dealing with Hitler, the propaganda master, because NSDAP, National and Socialist, did not add any new idea. Because look, national is the same as German. That means conservative. If you are a nationalist, then what kind of a nationalist are you? Of course, a German nationalist. So in other words, it's redundant. Nationalist and German, it's redundant. It's the same idea. And socialist and workers, Arbeiter, it's the same idea. the workers. They were, in their great majority, socialist. So in other words, he repeated the same idea in the name of the party. Why did he do this? Because simply, and when we will get to his Mein Kampf, it was simply he wanted repetition, to hammer it into the brains of people, that this was a party which was nationalist, conservative, and socialist workers. In other words, when he wanted everybody to become aware that he had these two ideas in the party's name and also in his outlook. So repetition, redundance, that's propaganda. Even the most primitive will remember that this is conservative and socialist together. And there is a second thing which strikes when you look upon it. That was, of course, already inherent here. Because normally, political parties, you are either conservative or you are social. Conservatives means you are a party which in the political spectrum is located on the right. When you are socialist or workers, then on the political spectrum you are on the left. So it is highly unusual that a party would be at the same time appealing to people from the right and people from the left. In other words, you have to make up your mind. The interest of conservative, let's say, of the conservative wing or the conservative part of the civil society are not the same than the interest of the unions of the workers, of those who are on the left. Why did Hitler then insist so much upon it? That is essentially, to some degree, his deep conviction. He wanted to appeal to the whole German party. He had the pretension that every German, wherever he was standing either on the right or on the left, should join. He wanted to have the whole population represent, the whole folk, as that is a word which the Nazis liked very much, folk, that the whole population would be represented. Of course, this, you could say, that is highly unrealistic. You cannot at the same time defend the interest of the right and the interest of the left, the interest of the big capital and the interest of the poor workers. That is incompatible, and that is realistically true. You cannot be at the same time a defender of those of the rich and the poor, because somehow that does not fit, usually. Why did he do it? That is opportunism. He tried to attract the votes from everywhere. Now, there is no doubt that deep in his heart, as from Vienna days on, we know that he was anti-Marxist, against socialism, against Marxism, because he was convinced that socialism and Marxism were egalitarian, put all men on the same level, and he rejected this. So in other words, there was already from the beginning on a strong dose of hypocrisy, if not to say cynicism, in all this. Because in reality, he was conservative. But because he had this pretension to appeal nonetheless to the workers, this, what you could say, it was like a revolutionary element of conservatism. It was like Mussolini. The fascists in Italy did the same. He had them as an example. So in other words, by changing the name and using these redundant abbreviations, Nationalsozialistische Arbeiterpartei, in short, Hitler already showed his colors, which he will use to the end. That's one thing. Secondly, he had a party program developed, because after all, as a party, he had to have a program. And the man who developed this program, you'll find the name in Fest, even though he was a non-entity and he will disappear in history, but at the beginning, Hitler looked as if he gave him any kind of consideration. His name was Gottfried Feder. he is the man who wrote up the program. But of course, he wrote up the program on Hitler's directives. Hitler was the one who told him what to put on this program. And here we have again an element of vanity on the part of Hitler. Because we are now in 1920. In 1920, Hitler was on the one side looking towards Italy, towards Mussolini, who was not yet in power at that time, but who was moving. Mussolini will come to power only two years later. But Hitler was looking also towards the east, and not as an example, but as an, let's say, as a potential enemy. That was Lenin, the communist. Now, Lenin had written up by that time, in 1920, a program for an international communist organization which was called Comintern. Comintern, Communist International. We will come back to this later. This Comintern had a program in 21 points. There were 21 articles or 21 points of this program. Hitler, of course, he wanted to do better. So he had his program developed on 25 points. So it is a little bit ridiculous, because you can have a program in 5 or in 10 points which would be as important as one in 20 or in 21 or 25. But this was just to give himself more important, 25 points. Now, we are not going to examine these 25 points. I reassure you immediately. Because that would not make much sense. But in these 25 points, he promised something to everybody. In other words, every German could find something which the Nazis promised for him if they voted for the Nazis. There was just one category of people which was excluded, which was even referred to negatively. And you have already guessed whom? The Jews. Because in these 25 points, there was nothing which was promised to the Jews. On the contrary, more than one of these points was very clearly tainted with more than latent anti-Semitism, because the Jews were called the profiteers of the bloodsuckers and what have you, those who were responsible for Germany's demise. So in other words, the 25 points of the program of the party reflected this political opportunism.
Did any of the people that he was trying to recruit call him on the fact that his policies were contradicting?
No. Well, I mean, this was so evident. But, you know, at this time, we are 1920, he was still totally unknown. This was just a troublemaker in Munich who was appealing to a limited part of the Munich and of the population in southern Bavaria. There were many fellows like Hitler. Nobody did take him seriously at that time, so nobody cared for this. And of course, you can imagine that the Nazis did not attract a Jewish following. So, this 25-point program, Hitler will not change them. He kept them from 1920 on until 1933, until he was in power. So, unlike Mussolini changed a little bit, depending on the political circumstances. In other words, Mussolini was even more opportunistic than Hitler. Did not change them. He kept this as the party program. But we do not get to know, when we examine this 25, if we would not get to know what the Nazis really were. What the Nazis really were, we will find out when we will have a look on Hitler's book, which he wrote when he was in captivity, when he was in prison, not in captivity, when he was in prison in 1924. So far for the party program. Now, Hitler also gave the party a new emblem, a new symbol. And this symbol, I have always difficulties, I must admit, that's one of my weaknesses. It's the swastika. The swastika will be used for the Nazis as a symbol. it's a cross with this extension. I think it's this one. This one here. I'm sorry, but I have always to look at it to find out which one is the right one. Here. Let me see. So the swastika, this is an old symbol which was used in the Sudeten area, that is in the area of where a German minority lived in Czechoslovakia. There was a party which had also this symbol. Hitler was not very innovative. He usually borrowed from here and from there. And the swastika could even be found in other places than Germany, even in other continents where it was used as an old, nearly prehistoric symbol. Now, Hitler added something to it. It was put into a circle, and this circle was, I think the circle was red, and then around the circle is a circle white.
Yeah.
Then the frame in which the circle was embedded was red. So in other words, swastika, white, red. Now, what is the symbolism of the swastika? He simply took it as a symbol, and it was already used by others. White, because white is the color of the conservatives. The conservatives used always, or the right used the color white, and the red, of course, is the color of the socialists, of the revolutionaries. So in other words, even in the emblem, red and white, he tried to suggest that he was conservative and revolutionary at the same time.
I just read, after I was just reading up on this, it also said that like it was used because it was the old German colors of like the old German nation, red, white, and black.
That might be true, but I rather believe that it was more in relationship with the NSDAP, with the name of the party. He wanted to appeal to the conservatives and he wanted to appeal to the socialists. That is, to be conservative and revolutionary at the same time. So far for this, for the emblem, which they used all over. Now next, there's another innovation which he introduced. An innovation that is, it was not that new. Most political parties in Germany had paramilitary organizations which supported the party. The communists, they, of course, from Soviet days on, they had the Red Guards, which later on will become the Red Army. The communists in Germany also had a red militia. The socialists also had a militia which supported them, an armed group. And there was ultimately a veteran organization which supported the conservatives, and that was the biggest one. This was called the steel casket, Stahlhelm. Stahlhelm, this is the word which refers to the casque which the old imperial army had in order to protect the head of the soldiers. Stahlhelm, a steel helmet, which it was a typical with this kind of an vertical bar coming out of this Stahlhelm. That was a symbol of another paramilitary organization. Now Hitler wanted to have, parallel to the political organization, to the party, he wanted to have this paramilitary organization. And he called upon one man whom he knew from the end of the war on, and whom he considered as his best friend, and this one man also considered Hitler as his best friend. And this man's name is Röhm, Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm, he was a captain. At the end of the war he was promoted to major, but he was most of the time a captain who had served in the German army, and he is on your agenda, on your list in Fest. So I would strongly advise you for next time that you would read first what he has to say about Ernst Röhm, this captain. Now, he was the go-between originally between Hitler and the army, when Hitler was his intelligence officer for the army, and when he was this orator who was supposed to indoctrinate the recruits. It was Röhm who had hired Hitler, and he was the go-between. Now, Hitler used now Röhm's capacity. Röhm was a very special character. He was personally a homosexual. The difference was that there were other homosexuals in those days, but Röhm did not make a secret out of it. Usually, in those days, in the establishment, you would hide, if you were homosexual, you would hide this reality, because it was not looked upon with tolerance, it was looked upon negatively. But Röhm did not hide it. And that was something which shocked many of his contemporaries. But this being said, Röhm was an excellent officer, and he was an organizer, and he was without scruples. He was absolutely without scruples, and you find more out of it when you concentrate on Fest. Now, Röhm organized now for Hitler this paramilitary organization. Now, the full German word is Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers. Stormtroopers, that's the abbreviation SA. Now, this SA, they had a uniform, and this uniform was brown. It was a brown uniform, therefore they will be referred to as the brown shirts, the brown shirts. They also had weapons, they had guns, and they made sometimes military parades. They would organize a march through Munich, and Hitler would pass these parades in review. They had as main goal to protect the meetings of the party and to create trouble with the other parties. That is, to break up the meetings of other parties or to beat up other party members. So in other words, they had, who were then those? Where did Röhm recruit those? Essentially among war veterans, among demobilized soldiers who were unable to find a place in the civil society, to find a job, to be those who were unemployed.
Where was the money coming from for this paramilitary?
We'll come to this question, yes. This unit, this paramilitary organization, the SA, was practically growing parallel to the party. Not every party member was a member of the SA, most SA people also were members of the party, but not always. In other words, you could say that National Socialism had two faces, had two main organizations: a party, a civilian party, and a paramilitary organization. On the one, Hitler was the head of the civilian organization, and Röhm the head of the paramilitary organization. Now, the two, Hitler and Röhm, they got well along with one another. Röhm was the only one who did, when he spoke to Hitler, who used the direct personal article, du. In English you cannot say you, could be the polite or the intimate way of addressing to somebody. In German you have two possibilities. You say du or sie. Sie is a polite form when you speak to somebody. Sie. Du is only when you know somebody so well that you can get on personal terms. Röhm was the only one who in his meetings, in his, let's say, being together with Hitler, could use the word, the direct, intimate du, which is a clear sign that he had absolutely Hitler's confidence and that Hitler knew him well and appreciated him well. All the others had to call Hitler Sie, the polite, distant formula. Now, the question behind all this is there was a fundamental issue. Because Hitler considered that the most important element was the party, the NSDAP. And the party had a subsidiary which would protect it, which the party could use. That was the SA. Röhm, on the other hand, he looked upon it differently. Röhm, he was a military always, even as a civilian. Röhm considered that the most important organization of the two was the SA, and that the SA had a party, the NSDAP, which would serve its political interest. So in other words, there was a matter of priority. Which of the two was most important? For Hitler, there was no doubt. The party was the most important and had, as an ally, as a junior partner, the SA. Röhm saw it the other way around. Röhm considered that the paramilitary organization was the important organization which had a party to serve its political ambitions.
Did most of the paramilitary units have political ambitions, or was it more often that they were like subsidiaries of a political party?
I did not understand your question.
Would it have been common for the paramilitary units to have
No.
a political agenda?
No, it was, well, let's say, this ambivalence. You raised the question, why did those paramilitary organizations come into existence in Germany? Why did they not exist in other countries? Because in other countries there were political parties who did not have paramilitary organizations. The reason is essentially because the German army was cut down to 100,000, where it had been in earlier days, the standing army 800,000. So the second thought behind these paramilitary organizations was not just to protect the party in question, but was to have a reservoir if the days would come when this clause limiting the size of the German army would be abolished, then immediately the members of these paramilitary organizations who had already, in practical terms, a certain training in weapons, could immediately be recruited in the official army. That was the original aim. So that but in clear nonetheless, for all the other parties, the paramilitary organizations were subordinated to the party and not the other way around. Röhm looked upon it differently. And this different appreciation of what was more important, who was number one of this ambivalence will remain and will end only on June the 30th, 1934, when Hitler was in power, when he ordered Röhm and the leadership of the SA to be assassinated by the SS. In other words, this ended up in a settling of accounts through violence, through assassination. When Hitler was already in power, Röhm and his fellow commanders of the SA will be assassinated by the Gestapo and by the SS in 1934, but that was long away at the time when Hitler created the SA with Röhm's support in 1920. Now, there was, in addition to the SA, there was also soon afterwards a second paramilitary organization. I left, besides the SA, remember SA, Sturmabteilung, Stormtroopers, brown uniform, Hitler created a second unit, which will not play a very important role in the first part of his political activity, that is in the 20s. But it came into existence nonetheless at that time. And these were the SS. The German SS is an abbreviation for Schutzstaffeln, which means protective squad. Protective squad.
What year was this?
That was 1920, also relatively early. Now, this Schutzstaffel, the SS, had originally only one role, to be Hitler's bodyguards. In other words, they were in charge of his personal protection when he went around, when he organized a meeting, when he made speeches, and so on. So, in other words, the SS were Hitler's bodyguard, because that comes already out of the name, Schutzstaffel, protective squad. It only later on, from the late 20s, early 30s on, it became a vast organization rival to the SA. Now, because these were Hitler's personal bodyguards, here, whereas in the SA, Röhm recruited all the trouble-rousers, all those unruly, half criminal, half psychopathic elements, anybody who wanted to join, the rowdies, the hooligans, whatever, could join the SA. But the SS, they were more selective. You had to fulfill certain criteria, in physical terms, also in intellectual terms, and also in terms of, let's say, National Socialist ideas. So in other words, you could say, I hesitate a little bit to use the word, but it was an elite organization. You had to fulfill more criteria than just be an ordinary troublemaker. But the SS will play a role only later, not at this time. And therefore, I do not mention, by the way, Himmler, the man who became the leader in 1929, was not yet on stage at that time, at least not with the SS. Now, so far for this. So we have, from 1920 on, we have a party with a new name, National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazis, with an emblem, the swastika, white circle, red background, with a program, 25 points, and also with a paramilitary organization, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts. Hitler was recruiting now, but not recruiting all over Germany. It was in the Munich neighborhood and in southern Bavaria. So in other words, his basis, the basis for his party was essentially Bavaria and even southern Bavaria. And so the number of party members, the same as the number of SA, was rising all the time. Now, a word about Hitler. You raised the question, well, where did the money come from? Hitler was, and we are not yet through, I would like maybe to say one, before we address ourselves to the money problem, there was one more thing. Hitler got to know, also in these days, around 1920, a number of other people, also journalists. One journalist who was, I spare the name because there would be too many. This journalist helped him put up a newspaper, because a party could not exist if it did not have a newspaper on its own. And this newspaper will be, the German name is Völkischer Beobachter, which means popular observer. It was not a newspaper with a huge number of issues, but it was used, and in this newspaper Hitler and his collaborators spread the National Socialist ideas, because that was necessary in order for propaganda purposes. Now, a word about the financial situation. Hitler was able, because he was a right-wing, let's say, party leader, he was able to make some contacts with rich industrialists, with people who had money in Munich, who will support him financially. So that, for instance, the piano-producing family of the Bechstein would support him, and then there were others. So a number of rich people supported the Nazis. You must not forget that the overall context was Munich, the same as Berlin, had been the stage in 1919, in March, May. In Berlin it was in January, the stage of a communist upheaval. Munich had even a communist government for several weeks. So in other words, the rich people, they were concerned about the potential communist danger, and we'll come back to that. So they supported then those who were openly anti-communist, and so the Nazis got money. Hitler could use this money for propaganda purposes, to organize his newspaper as well as to organize the SA. But he also requested those who joined the party and those who joined the SA that they should pay for their own uniforms. In other words, he was not now illimitedly rich. He also used the membership dues of the party members and also of the SA. Now, Hitler himself was following a relatively moderate lifestyle. He had an apartment, he did not have a huge villa or palace. He lived very modestly. The only, let's say, luxury extravagance, which he will develop later on, was a car. He liked big cars. And he had especially built for him a Mercedes. And I think I might have mentioned it in this class, or I keep confusing, I mentioned it maybe with your predecessors, that Hitler's Mercedes was sold at the end of the war, and I think it was bought by an American amusement park. I do not know exactly who, but it must be somewhere either in Florida or in another place where Hitler's car found, of course, a certain publicity. Now, that was the only extravagance, the luxury, this car. Otherwise, Hitler had, as I said, a moderate lifestyle. But he did get money from rich people, because otherwise he could not have functioned. By the way, Lenin, the communist leader, also the communists, when they were in the underground, they got also money. And that was surprising. They got even money from rich people, which is for Bolsheviks, that was rather extraordinary, but that's another story. Now, Hitler's movement, the Nazis were growing in and around Munich. So by 1923, the Nazis represented a certain political force inside Bavaria and inside Munich. And so they represented now the third danger. That is, in Bavaria there were three relatively, let's say, problematic organizations. The monarchists, with their intentions of joining with Austria, but that was not now the most important threat to the integrity of Germany. The conservatives were a more serious force. The Bavarian conservatives were frankly anti-Weimar, and they certainly would not shy away from making a coup against Berlin. But the most dangerous were, of course, the Nazis, Hitler. Hitler was suffering from one inferiority complex, because the Bavarian conservatives, they refused to level with him. They considered Hitler as a man from the gutter. The Bavarian conservatives were of, let's say, socially speaking, higher background. They were either noble, like the three men I told you, Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser. They had particles von Kahr, von Lossow, von Seisser, or they had links with the upper middle class. And so they considered Hitler was the man from the gutter. and they would not, bow down to make a deal with Hitler. Sometimes Fest is also using the word the useful drummer. They let Hitler mobilize the lower sections of the population against Weimar. In that sense, Hitler was interesting, but they, under no circumstances, would consider Hitler as an equal. And Hitler resented this, because he felt that they treated him and his movement with a certain distance, not to say with contempt. Now, in November 1923, rumors were spread that the conservatives in Germany, and particularly in Bavaria, that they might plan a political coup against Berlin, against the Berlin government. In other words, there was a danger that the Bavarian conservatives might stage a major upheaval. And because of these multiple threats to the security and survival of the Weimar Republic, remember Ruhr occupation, total inflation and destruction of the German currency, separatism in the Rhineland, communism in Saxony, Thuringia, and now this triple danger in Bavaria, the President of the Republic, Ebert, he decided that he had to use his presidential decree, that there was an emergency situation, and something had to be done to ensure the survival of the regime against these multiple threats. But he himself did not want to act personally. He gave two men the order, by using these presidential powers, to preserve the integrity of the country. And these two men were the following. General Segt, he was the head of the army, and Gustav Stresemann. Gustav Stresemann was a politician who belonged to a right-center liberal party. This right-center liberal party was the DVP. We'll later on speak about parties. Stresemann was a right-center liberal. He was a former monarchist. He had, before 1918, he had supported the empire. He was a monarchist. And Stresemann and Segt was a general, but Segt was nonetheless, let's say, an intelligent, realistic general. He considered that the Weimar Republic, in the situation where Germany found itself in, was the lesser evil. That is, it was, in the eyes of Segt, Germany could only survive if it kept, for the time being, the Weimar Republic functioning. Because if it would change this, then there was a danger of foreign intervention and of graver, let's say, harshness which might befall Germany. So the general was a supporter of the Weimar Republic, not because of his intimate, heartfelt convictions, but for rational reasons. He considered that one had to preserve this regime, otherwise things would get worse. And Stresemann had the same reasoning. Stresemann had originally been a monarchist, but with the years passing by, Stresemann considered that the Weimar Republic was the best possible regime Germany could have at that time. And that is why he should do everything to save this regime. So in other words, the general and the politicians were, out of rational thinking, supporters of the Weimar Republic. The politician had practically converted to it. The general did it for realistic purposes. So what did now the president charge them to do? First, let's take Stresemann. Stresemann was ordered by the president to restore the German currency and try to get the French out of the Ruhr, because the two things were intimately related. So Stresemann then made contact with the British and with the Americans, with the United States and with Great Britain. He asked the British and the US government for support to recreate a new German currency. In other words, to simply put aside the existing currency and set up a new currency, which this new currency was called the Rentenmark. The name is not important. So in other words, a new currency was initiated by Stresemann, which would end inflation, because the official currency was worthless. So he created a new currency with monetary and financial support from the US and from Great Britain, because the United States and Great Britain considered that they could not let Germany go down the drain. And in order to put them back on their feet, they had to begin with the currency. But there was another problem. Stresemann also wanted to get the French out of the Ruhr, so that he could start the industrial production again, because from January 1923 on until November, nothing happened in the Ruhr area. The German steel mills were still, they did not work. So in other words, Stresemann called off the strike, the passive resistance. In other words, Stresemann simply said to the miners, you get back to the mines, and to the steelworkers, you get back to your factories. You start working again. He put them back onto their job. And the French, therefore, they were now in a delicate position, because the Germans were operating again their factories and their mines. The French did not need to keep their miners, which they had tens of thousands of French miners and French industrial workers to work in the Ruhr area. But there was another problem the French had, because the French had found out that the benefit they got out of operating the German coal mines and the German steel mills, that these benefits were practically annihilated by the cost to keep French miners in Germany operating. In other words, financially speaking, it was a failure. They did not make any money out of it. On the contrary, they spent more in upkeeping the French miners in the Ruhr area than in getting money out of the German coal and the German steel. So in other words, the French themselves, the French government, got into trouble with its own currency. The French franc had to be devaluated. In other words, the French needed monetary support in order to stabilize their own currency. And that is exactly what Stresemann now used to talk to the British and to the Americans, because the United States and the British had disapproved the French entry into the Ruhr area. They had condemned it. Now, when the French needed monetary support to stabilize their own currency, the US and the British told the French, we support you on the condition that you pull your troops out. And Stresemann, of course, was strongly behind this move. So Stresemann now had what he wanted. First of all, he had the monetary support to stabilize the German currency, and he had the political support to get the French troops out of the Ruhr. And the French, in other words, they set up a timetable where they would pull their troops out. And when the French pulled their troops out of the Ruhr area, the separatist movement, which they had triggered off when they had moved in, the separatist movement in the Rhineland collapsed. So in other words, the danger of Rhineland separatism was removed at the same time. So Stresemann did, in the few weeks when he was put in charge of this new mission, he was successful in introducing a new currency and getting the French out. How about the other problems now? How about Saxony-Thuringia, and how about Bavaria? The general Segt acted right away about Saxony-Thuringia, because in Saxony-Thuringia the government in place was threatened by a potential communist coup. So the German army moved in and simply arrested the communists and removed the government of Saxony-Thuringia and put it temporarily under direct control of the Weimar government in Berlin. So in other words, the communist danger was at once removed. But then the army moved to the Bavarian frontier, but did not cross into Bavaria. And Segt refused to take military action against what was going on in Bavaria, particularly as the dangers in Bavaria came from the conservatives and from the Nazis, that is, came from the right. And the same army, the Segt, had already in 1920, when the conservatives had already attempted a putsch, the one I was referring to, the Kapp putsch. That was the man who politically was in charge. In 1920, the army had refused to take action against the conservative coup in Berlin. But the conservative coup failed, not because the army intervened, but simply because the trade unions went on a general strike, and the putschists, that is, those who tried to seize power, had to give up after a few days. Here in Bavaria, Segt moved on the frontier and started waiting. What happened now? We are in November. And to be precise, November 9th, 1923. At that time, Hitler was reported that the Bavarian conservatives, Karl, Lossow, Seisser, planned a huge meeting in the Hofbräuhaus. And in other words, this meeting, Hitler considered, with all the rumors in the air, that this might be the beginning of a conservative march upon Berlin, and that he had not been informed about it. He had been left out as a consequence of the normal contempt in which the conservatives usually kept the Nazis. What happened now was he tried then to invite himself, that is, to intrude in this meeting. It was in the Bürgerbräukeller, it was not in the Hofbräuhaus, it was in another hall in Munich. So what happened was, when this conservative meeting was well on its way, all of a sudden the doors flung up and Hitler entered, accompanied by the SA, who were heavily armed. And he had a revolver in his hand, and when he entered to make a big impression, he was shooting into the ceiling. Everybody was scared, of course, and so he moved up to the desk, to the orator's desk, and asked the three conservative leaders, Karl, Lossow, and Seisser, to join him behind the stage, in a room behind the stage, where he told them that either they would join him in a march upon Berlin, or they would not leave the room alive. And of course, they were totally taken by surprise. But when they saw Hitler, who was nervously just gesticulating and who really looked as if he meant business, they in a situation of emergency, they then were agreed to join him. And so Hitler went back on stage and proclaimed the German Revolution. That now the Nazis and the conservatives would together organize a march upon Berlin and overthrow the Weimar Republic, take over. And he had even invited to come and join him, even though this man came in a little bit later, a general who had been the chief of staff of Hindenburg. He was the supreme commander of the German army in World War I, and his chief of staff was General Ludendorff. Now, Hindenburg was in reality only, I would say, the outside figure of the army high command. The real strong man behind Hindenburg was his chief of staff, Ludendorff. Now, Ludendorff was known for his ultra-conservative ideas and for his opposition to the Weimar Republic and for his willingness to do anything to overthrow the Weimar Republic. So Hitler called on Ludendorff to come and join, and so in his speech he was practically already distributing the main jobs of who would be in charge of what. So the other conservative present, they had to make a speech to their constituents, calling upon them that they would join Hitler. So in other words, the meeting, which was highly unusual and highly, I would say, improvised through Hitler's intervention, the meeting then ended, and those who were present, they agreed that the next day, November 10th, that then they would march upon Berlin. And when now the time came, I have to check to see whether it is from the 8th to the 9th or from the 9th to the 10th. I'm not sure anymore on the exact day. It might be that the meeting did take place on the 8th and that the march upon Berlin should begin on the 9th. I think that is the 8th was the eve of this march upon Berlin. That's the way. Please correct this. So the meeting did take place on the 8th, and the march should take place on the 9th. When the meeting was over, Hitler made then a fatal mistake. He let his involuntary allies, he let them go back. In other words, he did not keep them under his control. They went back to their respective headquarters. Kahr to the government, Lossow to the army headquarters, and Seisser to the police headquarters. And of course, as they went back, they were absolutely outraged and furious. They decided to bring this march, this Nazi march upon Berlin, to an end immediately. So the next day, when Hitler met on the appointed place where all the others had to join him, he was there alone with his SA. There were no army people, no police, and no government officials coming. So Hitler understood that his forced allies had let him down. But he could not at that moment call off the march. So he made a desperate bet. He thought that if he organized, nonetheless, on his own, with his SA, a march through Munich, that the Munich population might join him, and that he would force this way, with popular support, the hand to his unruly allies. But these unruly allies had ordered Seisser, the head of the police, to set up a barricade to stop the Nazis from carrying out this march. And when the Nazis now arrived at this barricade, the police called upon them to stop at once, but the Nazis disobeyed, and so the first shots did ring. And the consequence was that 60 Nazis fell down, were killed, others were wounded under the firing of the police, and 3 policemen died when the Nazis shot back. The only one who did not fall down on the ground was Ludendorff, the general, who had participated. The general was simply marching ahead, untouched by the bullets, passing through the ranks of the police. But this way, the Munich putsch ended miserably, pitifully. It was simply a catastrophe in the implementation of this putsch. Hitler was arrested 2 days later. Goering had been wounded and went into was brought abroad in order to recuperate. Hitler's putsch ended under the bullets of the Munich police under the orders of Colonel Seisser. So in other words, it was a pitiful failure. But it was followed, and I'll end here, it was followed by a trial. Hitler was put on trial after this for high treason. And at this trial, he was able to turn the tables around, to take full responsibility for the failed putsch, to accuse those who had brought about this failure of having betrayed the German honor. In other words, he accused Kahr and Lossow and Seisser that they had originally the same idea, but they were responsible for his failure, and the judges followed him. He got away. After 19 people being killed, he got away with being condemned to 5 years of arrest in a castle, Landsberg. So in other words, he became well known in Germany through his special speech he made at the court, and the judges followed him. So in other words, he was able to transform this pitiful failure of a putsch into a propaganda triumph for his own cause. We'll see more about this next time. Would you please be so good and concentrate on Infest, on Röhm and the Azay, and follow up in Bullock on the failed putsch. We'll come back to this next time.